Today at the National Press Club, Josh Frydenberg with the Treasurer's traditional post-budget address. This year's economic blueprint has been released, charting the path out of the COVID-induced recession. From the Great Hall of Parliament House, Josh Frydenberg with today's address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia here at the Great Hall at Parliament House and today's Westpac address. My name's Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president and I'm chief political correspondent for the ABC 730. Today's guest at the traditional post-budget address is the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who has just handed down his third budget and what looks like being the last budget before a federal election. It occurred to me this morning there's an obvious slogan for this budget, and I'm hoping that the Treasurer will explain why it's not being used. Jobs and growth. If you're following the conversation online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag is NPC. Everyone, please welcome the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Firstly, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present? Can I acknowledge the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack? Can I acknowledge the Finance Minister, my partner in this budget, Simon Birmingham? Can I acknowledge my many colleagues who are here today, and in particular the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Suka, and Jane Hume, who's the Minister for Financial Security, Women's Economic Security, who is here today, as well as many other colleagues. Can also acknowledge Dr. Stephen Kennedy as the Secretary of Treasury and Rosemary Huxtable, the Secretary of Finance, and thank their departments for the outstanding professionalism, dedication and capacity that they've shown over the course of this pandemic. The scale and the speed of decision-making has been unprecedented, and I think we can all in this room be very proud of the Australian Public Service, so thank you very much. Can I also acknowledge my wife, who's here without the kids? That's because my son, 4-year-old son, said attending last night's budget was the most boring thing he's ever done. And I think the cameras caught that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Australia is well on the road to recovery. And while the pandemic is not over, the Australian spirit continues to shine through. Recently, I met with Katie Graham, an owner of a small homeware store and cafe in Melbourne. They'd been in their premises for only 6 months when COVID hit. Suddenly their doors were closed, rent was due, and the staff needed to be paid. They took the difficult decision to stand down a staff member as they contemplated winding up their business. Then JobKeeper and the cash flow boost was announced. They brought back their staff and received temporary rent relief and a deferral on their bank loan with measures that were supported by the Morrison government. I spoke to Katie this week and her business is now back on its feet. She has kept all her staff and taken on a new one who was previously unemployed, and said that without the help of the federal government, her business would have folded and she feared she would have lost her house. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a story like so many others across the country. No community has been untouched. In response to the greatest economic shock since the Great Depression, we have now put in place an unprecedented $291 billion of direct economic support. That's more than double the commitments of all the state and territories combined, all aimed at helping get Australians through to the other side of this crisis. Extraordinary times have called for extraordinary measures. And as John Howard said to me on the eve of the announcement of JobKeeper, during times of economic crisis, there are no ideological constraints. The results are now clear. Our economy is coming back strongly. We have outperformed every major advanced economy in the world over the last 12 months. Consumer confidence is at an 11-year high. Business confidence is at a record high. And almost 1 million jobs have been added since the peak of the crisis. Australia's recovery is at the front of the pack. The economy is now expected to have reached its pre-pandemic level 9 months earlier than was forecast at the October budget. Real GDP is forecast to grow by 5.25% this calendar year, up from 4.25% at budget last year, to be around $50 billion higher across 2021. The unemployment rate is forecast to get back to pre-crisis levels just 2 years after its peak. This compares to 8 years after the recession of the 1990s and 10 years after the recession of the 1990s. It's worth remembering that following the GFC, the unemployment rate never got back to where it was. The unemployment rate is now forecast to reach 4.75% by the June quarter in 2023. With more Australians in work and less on welfare, the budget deficit this year has improved by $52.7 billion. There are good reasons for Australians to be confident about their economic future. But we all know that the job is not done. We are still in the middle of the pandemic. Here in Australia, we recently saw Western Australia go into lockdown. Around 800,000 new cases of COVID are being diagnosed around the world every day, and new strains of the virus continue to emerge. We've all witnessed the tragic events unfolding in India, and this is a solemn reminder of the threats that we face. That is why this year's budget is the next step in our economic plan to keep Australians safe and to secure our economic recovery. Our first priority must always be to protect Australian lives and contain the spread of the virus. Last night I announced a further $1.9 billion to support the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. With this investment, we have secured access to 170 million doses. We're also providing $1.5 billion to extend the COVID-19 health response until the end of 2021. This will continue to support rapid pathology testing and tracing that is so important to our continued success in containing the virus. And GP-led respiratory clinics, which have delivered more than 1 million COVID-19 tests. And it has been done to date, and it has continued the success on the health front that is the foundation for which we can secure our economic recovery. This budget will help secure our economic recovery in 3 important ways. First, it provides around $40 billion in targeted and temporary support to boost aggregate demand. Second, it invests in our workforce and skills to get more Australians into a job. And third, it provides incentives to boost workforce participation, particularly for women. There is no economic recovery without a jobs recovery. And there is no budget recovery without a jobs recovery. We must keep our momentum going, and we cannot afford to be complacent. We cannot risk losing the gains that have been made here in Australia as India's health crisis and the euro area's double-dip recession can attest. We must stick to our plan. even more so with monetary policy heavily constrained with interest rates at an all-time low and population growth at the lowest in a century. We must continue to support the transition to private sector-led growth to create jobs and drive unemployment even lower. That is why the next stage of our plan, outlined in the budget, is designed to achieve that very end. We are extending the low and middle income tax offset this coming financial year. This will benefit around 10.2 million Australians, with most of the benefit going to those with taxable incomes around below $90,000. It will put an additional $1,080 into the pockets of individuals and $2,160 for couples. And it will flow through the economy just as our tax relief has done during the crisis to fuel record growth in household spending. This has given businesses the confidence to invest, to grow, and to create more jobs. We're also extending our record business tax incentives to drive more investment throughout the economy. This includes temporary full expensing and the loss carryback arrangements. This will deliver a further $20.7 billion in tax relief for Australian businesses that back themselves and invest in their future. This will drive economic activity in the short term and increase productivity in the long term. We know that our initial round of business investment plans have brought on new investment. Take Visy, Australia's largest paper, packaging and recycling company, employing 7,000 Australians. As a result of the accelerated depreciation policy announced last October, Visy announced it would bring forward $380 million in new job-creating manufacturing investment over the next 18 months. A new corrugated box factory in Brisbane will not only create 300 jobs, but support the growth of the food and beverage companies in the area. With machinery and equipment investment growing at its fastest rate in 7 years, these investments are happening right now across the country. An estimated $320 billion of investment is expected to be supported by our business tax incentives and create 60,000 jobs by the end of 22-23. More investment also generates a growth dividend over the longer term. During a recession, falls in investment can erode the capital stock and cause a drop in productivity. Our existing and new business tax measures will help alleviate this. We're also investing in the infrastructure Australia needs for the future, which will create the jobs today. This budget commits an additional $15.2 billion as part of the government's record $110 billion 10-year infrastructure pipeline. This commitment will support over 30,000 jobs across our country, including in regional communities. This will see our infrastructure commitments over the next 4 years total over $70 billion. These measures will boost aggregate demand. They will lock in our recovery and they'll create more jobs. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that getting the unemployment rate below 5% will not be easy. The last time Australia sustained unemployment below 5% was between 2006 and 2008. Before that, you need to go all the way back to the 1970s. The budget forecasts that net overseas migration will be a decrease of 97,000 this year and 77,000 next year. This means less skilled migrants and less temporary workers in the short to medium term, making it harder for businesses to find the workers that they need. This is another reason why this budget continues to invest heavily in the skills that our economy needs today and into the future. We have committed more support for foundation skills so that any job seeker that needs it can receive training in literacy, numeracy and digital skills. We are investing further in the Job Trainer Fund, adding 163,000 places and extending the program until the end of next year. We have removed the cap on the number of trainees and apprentices under our $2.7 billion expansion to the Boosting Apprenticeship Commencement Scheme. Together, these measures will support a strong pipeline of new skilled workers and help boost participation and create jobs. As well as investing more in skills, the Morrison government wants to encourage even more Australians to participate in the labour market. Women's participation in the labour market has been rising over time. It currently sits at a record rate of 61.8%, up almost 7 percentage points since 2000. But despite this, it remains around 10 percentage points lower than the male participation rate. That is why the government has invested an additional $1.7 billion in last night's budget to improve childcare affordability. Our measures will benefit those families with multiple young children who face some of the highest barriers to participate in the labour market. This will improve affordability for around 250,000 families already in the childcare system and will equate to around 40,000 individuals working the equivalent of an extra day a week. Under these changes, a family earning $110,000 a year will have the subsidy for their second child increase and be $95 a week better off for 4 days of care. This will see more women in work, which is already at a record high. Further gains in closing the gender pay gap, which is already at a record low. And it will also bring more valuable talent and skills into the Australian labour market. This will benefit businesses and boost the economy by up to $1.5 billion a year. In this budget, we're also modernising our employment services to better match job seekers to the jobs. And we're increasing the wage subsidy for long-term unemployed job seekers from $6,500 to $10,000. That is how the budget will secure our economic recovery and drive unemployment down, by putting more money into the pockets of everyday Australians, providing incentives for private businesses to grow, to invest and to hire, investing in infrastructure, boosting skills and workforce participation. A lower unemployment rate will also put upward pressure on wages. As the labour market tightens, wages will begin to lift. Both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank have effectively said that the unemployment rate will need to have a 4 in front of it to see inflation and wages accelerate. The best way to deliver higher wages over time is to build a stronger and more productive economy and to drive unemployment down. That is why we have continued right through the pandemic to pursue sensible economic reforms. Reforms that make our economy more modern, dynamic and productive. Last night we launched a new patent box starting on the 1st of July next year. Under the patent box, income earned from new patents that have been developed in Australia will be taxed at a concessional 17% rate, almost half the rate that applies to large companies. We have cut red tape to allow for a uniform scheme for automatic mutual recognition of state and territory-based occupational licences and registrations. This reform will directly benefit over 124,000 workers who currently work across borders and an additional 40,000 workers who are expected to work across borders following these reforms. The time and cost savings associated with this reform for these workers is expected to increase GDP by $2.4 billion over the decade. We have also enhanced the R&D tax incentive, supporting more than 11,000 companies. We have made amendments to our insolvency framework to reduce complexity, time and costs. We have mandated electronic invoicing for all Commonwealth agencies. We have modernised business registers to reduce costs and cut red tape, and we have expanded the consumer data right to help consumers access better value services. There are many, many more examples of this type of microeconomic reform. A stronger and more dynamic economy is also the best way to deliver a stronger budget. Australia entered this crisis from a position of economic strength. This gave us the fiscal firepower we needed to respond to COVID-19 and to kickstart our recovery. And this strong recovery is already flowing through to a stronger budget position. Of the new decisions in the budget, around half reflect our further temporary support measures to support our recovery. Our tax cuts for individuals and businesses, our additional infrastructure and skills spending, and our additional spending on vaccines and COVID health measures. The other half reflects new investments, including more than $30 billion to undertake generational reform and lift the quality of essential services. These are important and necessary decisions. But despite these significant new investments, our overall fiscal position has not deteriorated. Our budget position has improved by $34.1 billion over the 4 years to 23-24 relative to the last budget. The budget deficit falls from 7.8% of GDP to 2.4% of GDP by the end of the forward estimates. Compared to budget last year, net debt, a key measure of fiscal sustainability, is projected to be lower each and every year over the next 10 years. And gross debt as a share of GDP peaks a year earlier. By the end of the medium term, gross debt is $65 billion lower compared to what was expected just over 7 months ago in last year's budget. We've been able to make these necessary investments without undermining our fiscal position because of our strong economic recovery. Since the last budget and before new policy, tax receipts excluding GST have been revised up by $81 billion over the 4 years to 23-24. Iron ore has also made its contribution to the improved budget position. Company tax receipts are up by $25 billion. But it is the strong recovery in the labour market that has materially strengthened the budget, with personal income tax receipts up by $44.3 billion over the 4 years to 23-24. And spending on unemployment benefits are down by $11.7 billion. The direct benefit from more Australians in work is the benefit to the budget is more than double the contribution made by higher company tax receipts through a higher iron ore price. This is the benefit of our strong economic recovery, and we remain in a strong and sustainable fiscal position. Our debt remains low by international standards. As a share of the economy, it is around half of that of the UK and the US, and less than a third of that in Japan. Our debt servicing costs also remain historically low. In 21-22, our interest bill will be $17.8 billion or 0.8% of GDP. This is lower than the interest paid in 2018-19 at $18.9 billion or 1% of GDP. Despite recent increases in bond yields, the weighted average cost of our new borrowing in this budget is assumed to be around 1.6%. Treasury projections are that nominal GDP growth will exceed the nominal interest rate for at least the next decade. This means our overall interest bill is forecast to remain low at below 0.9% of GDP over the forward estimates. And this will reduce net debt as a share of GDP over the medium term as outlined in the budget papers. This is a critical element of our medium-term fiscal strategy. Net debt is expected to peak at 40.9% of GDP in June 2025 and then improve over the medium term to reach 37% of GDP in June 2032. We can move forward with confidence knowing that our fiscal projections are not beholden to volatile commodity prices. Today, the iron ore price is at record levels, trading at over $200 a tonne free on board. But our government has continued to adopt a prudent approach in this budget. We do not assume that those prices are sustained at such high levels. We protect the budget by not baking in future spending against a record high iron ore price. Instead, we assume that iron ore prices will fall back to $55 a tonne by the March quarter next year. This is in line with Treasury's best estimate of the long-term equilibrium price in the market. Of course, should iron ore prices remain at elevated levels, this will provide an upside to the budget bottom line. By way of example, if the iron ore price remains at above $150 a tonne until March next year, this would deliver a $12.5 billion boost to tax revenue over the next 2 years. Targeted and temporary measures to secure the economic recovery, prudent assumptions to protect the budget, strengthening the sustainability of our fiscal position by growing our economy and getting more Australians into work and off welfare. That is our plan. A plan that is working and a plan we must stick to in order to lock in the gains we have made. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, repairing the budget and growing the economy are always the best way to guarantee essential services. This budget undertakes generational reforms that will improve the quality and the sustainability of our essential services across aged care and mental health over the long term. We all want to see an aged care system that treats older Australians with the respect and the dignity that they deserve. Since the 18-19 budget, the Morrison government has committed to 83,000 additional home care packages. And in this budget, we have gone further. We'll be providing a record funding increase of $17.7 billion to improve the quality, the safety and the provision of aged care services. This is the single largest investment ever made in the sector. We are funding the immediate priorities in the system to improve quality and safety. But importantly, we're also reforming the sector, from home care right through to residential care, to ensure its long-term sustainability and to grow and to upskill the aged care workforce. We're providing $6.5 billion for the release of an additional 80,000 home care packages, and giving the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission greater oversight of the home care system. We're providing $8.4 billion to reform residential care. We're increasing the minimum standard of care minutes provided to residents. And we're reforming the way residential care providers receive funding. Delivering a new, improved model for assessing people's care needs and targeting funding for care where it is needed most. Our comprehensive plan to strengthen the aged care system will improve the quality and the availability of care and strengthen oversight in the sector and create more care jobs. Ladies and gentlemen, for many Australians, COVID-19 has been an extremely difficult and testing time. And it's been a reminder to us all of the importance of protecting our mental health. In this budget, we are making a record investment of $2.3 billion in the mental health prevention and resilience services, suicide prevention services and expanded treatment options. We're establishing a new national network of adult mental health centres alongside states and territories, which will operate under a no wrong door approach so that everyone gets the care that they need. The centres will provide a new approach through multidisciplinary teams. Psychiatrists, GPs, psychologists, alcohol and drug specialists, mental health nurses, social workers and other specialists working together. We're also improving the availability of high-quality, free and low-cost digital mental health services to give people better options to access help earlier. And to help us work towards a goal of zero suicides in Australia, we're establishing a National Suicide Prevention Office to provide a nationally consistent whole-of-government approach to prevention. These are transformational investments in mental health that will help save lives and deliver a stronger economy through higher workforce participation. Ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here today, Australia is as well placed, if not better placed, than any other country in the world. In the midst of a global pandemic, we have successfully suppressed the virus. Our economic recovery now has real momentum. Our budget position is strengthening, our plan is working, but there is more to do. We cannot risk losing the gains that we have made. We must secure our economic recovery, and last night's budget does exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Treasurer. You've talked in the speech about keeping the momentum going, and we have got a competitive advantage at the moment in that we have suppressed the virus, but the prospects of that advantage being continued is obviously disappearing as countries start to open their borders. For 40 years we've heard about the need to be an open economy. The AI groups in us Woolix today was talking about us being a gilded cage in this budget, that it's basically an economy that's looking in on itself. When will we know, when will we have a clear roadmap out of how the government plans to gradually open the economy?
Well, Laura, as we've said repeatedly, we will open the international borders when it's safe to do so, and that means basing our decisions on the medical advice. What we have seen is an increase in the global number of cases, new variants, and real issues about the transmissibility of the virus. And we cannot afford to take the risk right now to open our borders in a way that would compromise the health of Australians. So we're unapologetic about putting the health of Australians first. Ultimately, this is primarily a health crisis with a very severe economic impact. And our economic recovery would be put in doubt if we weren't able to successfully suppress the virus. Treasury make a number of assumptions in this budget. They're not policy decisions, they're assumptions about how we contain new outbreaks, when the international borders open, when the vaccine is rolled out. But when you speak to Treasury about the impact of those assumptions on their economic forecast, the most important one is our ability to contain the spread of the virus here in Australia when we have outbreaks, which is inevitable. And so we cannot compromise our health position and our ability to contain that spread by having any more cases than otherwise would eventuate through a proper quarantine process. So from our perspective, we have established a working assumption in the budget that international borders open gradually from the end of from the middle of next year. We'll start to take more student cohorts, smaller student cohorts, from the end of this year. But again, they're merely assumptions, not policy decisions. And if the medical advice is different to that on either side of that decision from mid-next year, then we would follow the medical advice. But you've seen here recently in Australia the lockdown in Western Australia from just a few cases. We saw what happened in Victoria. An extended lockdown would very much damage the recovery, and we can't afford to go back there.
Hi, Mr. Frydenberg. Phil Curry from the Australian Financial Review. Just on taxation, when the government announced its big income tax plans some years back, the LMITO, the low and middle income tax offset, was supposed to expire once stage 2 was introduced, that it would be baked into the stage 2 tax cuts. Now, you brought forward stage 2 last year. You gave LMITO as well as a stimulus measure, and in yesterday's budget, you're rolling it over for another year.
Yeah.
So now Labor is making noises today about LMITO, shouldn't be turned off at the end of next year, especially in the light of the stage 3 tax cuts coming in a couple more years. Will this be the last year that the LMITO will be rolled over, regardless of the election timing? And are the stage 3 tax cuts still affordable in your view?
Two questions there. Firstly, we can only make decisions on the facts that we have right now, and that is that we needed to put in place this $7.8 billion additional year of LMITO, the low and middle income tax offset as a fiscal stimulus in order to support aggregate demand and therefore support job creation. And if you are a tradie or a nurse or a teacher earning between $48,000 and $90,000, you get $1,000 and just over $1,000 in your pocket at the end of your tax year. That's a significant boost to household income. But it's not a permanent feature of the tax system. What is going to be a permanent feature of the tax system is having one big single tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000, having abolished the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket. That is stage 3 of our tax plan, and it is affordable, and it will create a stronger system. Now, the Labor Party have not said if they're committed to stage 3, even though at the time it passed through the Parliament, they said they supported our tax cuts. But if, Phil, they were to abandon stage 3 or propose to abandon stage 3, it would mean that somebody on $80,000 a year, so very much a middle income earner, would be $900 a year worse off. And what we have done with stage 3 is ensure that the progressive nature of our tax system remains, so that the top 5% of income earners are paying 1/3 of the overall tax burden. That is before stage 3 and that is after stage 3. And if you're earning $200,000 a year, you are earning 4 times as much as somebody who earns $50,000 a year. But if you earn $200,000 a year, you will pay 8 times as much tax after stage 3 of our tax plan is implemented. So it very much maintains a progressive tax system, but what it does do is ensure that 95% of taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. So it's a significant reform. It is affordable. It's already legislated, so it's in the numbers and the budget papers as issued yesterday, but it is a much better way forward than extending the LMITO indefinitely.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Treasurer, before the budget there was a lot of discussion outside and within government about whether the legislated rises in the superannuation guarantee, the staged rises up to 12%, should remain or be removed or changed. The government in the end decided not to interfere with those rises. Can you promise that after the election this will be a forever position of the government?
Well, our position has remained consistent, that these are legislated increases, with the 9.5% going to 10%, as you know, from mid this year. But the think tank, which is your namesake, the Grattan Institute, and also the RBA and others, had commented about the adequacy of retirement incomes with a 9.5% SG. And so that debate was happening independent of government. That debate was also kicked along by the Callaghan report into retirement incomes, which found that increasingly people are bequeathing quite a large sum of money at the end of their lives, having accumulated it through their lives. And so there was, and there is, a real issue about the adequacy of retirement incomes, whether it's at 9.5%, 10% or even a higher rate. But our position remains consistent, Michelle, that is legislated, and we didn't announce any changes in last night's budget.
Patrick Commons.
Treasurer, Patrick Commons from the Australian newspaper. You talked a lot about business spending and business investment and what the government's doing to promote that. And the budget papers show a big lift in business investment in 2022, 2023 financial year. But there's been a bit of a lukewarm response from the business community. They think that more should be done to promote longer-term investment, to get the longer-term investment that the country needs. So what more can the government do to make sure that this lift in business investment is not a temporary one?
Well, I was just going to read you a quote from the business community last night. This is what Jennifer Westacott from the Business Council of Australia said. This budget propels Australia out of the pandemic and lays the foundations for a jobs-led recovery. This is what Innes Willocks from the Australian Industry Group said about the second year budget. It locks in the recovery from recession and shifts gears from emergency measures to investing in the economy for the longer term. And this is what Chris Richardson, noted economist, said: it is absolutely the right budget for the times. The fight against COVID has become the fight against unemployment. Now, that is what our budget does. It seeks to drive more Australians into work and the unemployment rate even lower than where it is today. The business investment incentives, which we've kicked on for an extra year, are actually having an effect, and I alluded to this in my speech. Normally in a recession you see a capital strike which has a long-term effect on the economy, and the contrary is true. We have seen recent data show that there's been around a big jump in investment in machinery and equipment, just over 8%, which is the highest in 7 years. And we know that businesses' capital expenditure expectations are now the highest in many, many years. And business conditions, as I said in the speech, are also at record highs. So business is backing these investment incentives. They cover businesses with a turnover of up to $5 billion. There are many practical examples of businesses taking advantage of this ability to write off purchases straight away. And as far as the structural position of the budget, it doesn't affect it really in the medium term. It washes its way out because it's really a timing issue for the budget. Businesses are bringing forward expenditure to capitalise on this rather than depreciating these investments over a longer period of time.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Treasurer. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Treasurer, the Prime Minister yesterday talked about, and this morning talked about, how the pandemic is still raging around the world. Yep. Yesterday to the Coalition Party Room, from what I'm told, he said that the threat from the pandemic is greater today than it was 1 year ago. Yep. And in your budget speech, you talked about making Australia more resilient against the pandemic. One of the ways in which to make Australia more resilient is quarantine. You've talked about $500 million for the Howard Springs Quarantine Centre in the Northern Territory, but there are calls for a bigger capacity in quarantine. In last night's budget, for instance, there's $200 million for the MyGov website, $300 million for an online health record. There's $500 million right there. What's the priority, a bigger website or a bigger quarantine capacity? Why do we not have a commitment in last night's budget for bigger quarantine? Why do you not build a second Howard Springs?
Well, David, as you know, the Victorian government has put a proposal to the federal government about new quarantine facilities in that state. And the Prime Minister has indicated that we are working through that particular application from them, and will respond in due course. But also don't forget that the quarantine responsibilities, as decided through National Cabinet quite early in this pandemic, were going to rest primarily with the states. Yes, we've got Howard Springs, but the primary responsibility had been resting with the states. Now, by and large, our quarantine system has been effective, but for the events in Victoria where there was a catastrophic failure. No one wants to see a repeat of that. We had the Jane Holton review. The states have done further work to strengthen their quarantine systems, but with respect to new federal investments in quarantine in the states, the first proposal that we're looking through is the one from Victoria, and we'll respond to that in due course.
The proposals along the similar lines from other states, would you back those?
Well, again, other states can propose whatever issues they see fit. We'll whatever proposals came from states, we would consider them again in due course through the proper processes.
Treasurer, if I could just intervene there. Given the need for presumably an exponential increase in the quarantine capacity, shouldn't this have been something that was actually sort of considered in the budget and discussed at greater length with the states to be included in the budget?
Well, Laura, the most comprehensive proposal has come from Victoria, and we are working that through our internal processes. But like I said earlier, the state quarantine systems outside of Victoria, and they have obviously worked to improve their system, has been largely very effective, and the bulk of the heavy lifting with respect to quarantine has been done in New South Wales, who have been taking 2, 3, 4 times the number of people that have, than other states have been, yet that is the state that hasn't gone into a lockdown at all across the whole state, hasn't gone into a statewide lockdown over the course of this pandemic, and it's a real credit not just to their political leadership but also their quarantine system.
Peter Van Onselen.
Peter Van Onselen, Network 10. You've often described John Howard as a mentor. As Treasurer, he worked for a pretty unimpressive Prime Minister. He presided over a recession, and he only handed down one balanced budget. The rest were wall-to-wall deficits. Are you worried that that could be your fate, or do you see the upside? Or do you see the upside? He managed to, despite a pretty poor treasurership, go on to become a very successful long-term Prime Minister once he was able to get his own way on things.
Always a provocative question from PVO. Look, the reality is, Peter, certainly when I took on the role of Treasurer, I couldn't have expected or dreamed of the fact that I'd be standing here having just announced the budget that I did last night, because nobody could have envisaged that we would go through a once-in-a-century pandemic and the biggest hit to the Australian economy since the Great Depression. I mean, Australia has been hit by an economic meteor. 1.3 million of our fellow Australians either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero. So just as John Howard said to me, in times of national crisis, there are no ideological constraints. We acted, and decisively and comprehensively. And the net result of that is we are the first of the major advanced economies to see our employment levels now rise above where they were going into the pandemic. 75,000 more Australians are in a job today than when this crisis first hit. And we have stood pretty firm when it comes to extending programs like JobKeeper, which the opposition asked us to do beyond 12 months, and standing firm on issues like that have actually been the right decision, because over 100,000 people have come off income support since JobKeeper ended, and that cliff that some people were speculating on never arrived. So we continue to roll out our plan. We made a decision as a leadership team, as a cabinet, as a government, that this budget was not a time for austerity. We couldn't take our foot off the accelerator. We had to consolidate the gains, because if we didn't, those gains could have been lost. This global environment is still pretty fragile, and it's a confidence game. And unless people in this room and businesses right around the country, big and small, have confidence that we're successfully suppressing the virus, they won't invest, they won't hire, they won't grow. And that's why we are taking those difficult decisions around borders. That's why we are spending in areas like skills and infrastructure. I'm very confident that we have taken the right decisions to support the economy. And if you ask me what I think has been the most significant achievement of the Australian public over the last 12 months, and indeed the government's support in that achievement, has been we've prevented a generation of Australians being lost to long-term unemployment. That was in question when Treasury said that the unemployment rate could reach as high as 15%, and we saw those images of our fellow Australians lining up outside Centrelink, and they were reminiscent of the Great Depression. That level of fear was right across the economy. And we acted decisively, and now Australia is ahead of the global pack.
Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer, Andrew Probyn from the ABC. As you were pointing out, net overseas migration is going to be negative 97,000 this year and 77,000 the next. So I'm sure you'd agree that migrants are gold at this stage. You nod there. Well, I'm just I'm seeking an explanation as to why in a budget paper number 2, page 179, why you should be stripping $671 million from the supports that the government does give to new migrants for services such as the AAT, health, social services, when of course in an economic terms at least, you should be throwing bouquets at them rather than punishing them.
Well, there are a number of measures in this budget that are actually providing additional services to migrants, some of whom have obviously gone home. Some of the temporary migrants went home during the course of the pandemic, and others have stayed, and we do continue to provide those economic supports. But when you reference net overseas migration, Andrew, it does go down 77,000, but then it actually rebuilds. It rebuilds to just over 90,000 in 22-23, which is when we said in the budget we have an assumption that the border will gradually reopen. And then it gets as high back to where it was pre-pandemic at around 235,000 a year. So in the budget there are a number of measures that are designed to provide additional support to refugees and migrants, as well as, of course, supporting net overseas migration when it is safe to do so.
But what's the public policy behind $671 million saving here, stripping them of this support?
Well, we're not stripping support. What we're seeking to do is to provide the support to those migrants in the same way that we've always have, but at the same time, when it comes to net overseas migration, ensure that it rebuilds when it is safe to do so.
Andrew Connell.
Treasurer, Andrew Connell from Sky News. Press Club last year, I'm sure you remember, you spoke about supply side reform and Thatcher and Reagan type policies. You told the Coalition Party Room in June last year the next election would be about limitless providers versus enablers. I'm going to borrow the vernacular of a former Treasurer and say what is in the budget for the true believers, the true Liberal believers, the ones who believe in a reforming Conservative government who are better than the other mob at budget repair. What is the difference between a Liberal and a Labor government at the moment?
Well, this is a Liberal budget. Firstly, it stays true to the Menzian tradition of getting more Australians into home ownership. There's the First Home Super Saver scheme. There's the new measures that we introduced to enable single parents with a deposit as low as 2% to get into their first home. And of course, Home Builder has been an enormous success with more than 120,000 applications. This budget supports retirees. Remember our political opponents, you referenced Labor, having a retirees tax. This budget is enabling retirees to put more money into superannuation by downsizing their home at age 60, not 65, and putting up to $300,000 into their super. It's abolishing the work activity test for someone aged 67 to 74. We've also supported the regions with record amount of support, whether it's infrastructure that's transport or water infrastructure or better telecommunications connectivity, particularly in bushfire-prone areas, as well as biosecurity and our Ag 2030 project. There's support for families with the tax cuts, because it's only been the Coalition, Andrew, that has delivered around $300 billion of tax cuts in the last 4 budgets, and as I said earlier, has put in place a historic reform to abolish a whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, to flatten out, to strengthen, to create a fairer tax system. And at the heart of this budget is the concept of backing the private sector. I said it in my speech last night. 8 out of every 10 jobs in Australia are in the private sector. And we want the private sector to feel confident to invest, to hire and to grow. That's what the business investment incentives are about. That's what the loss carryback measures are about. That's what measures like regulatory change around the AAT and the ATO are all about. So this budget stays true to the Liberal Party's values and principles, but it also responds in the middle of a pandemic. And again, if you want to quote doyens of the Liberal Party, whether it's Menzies, it could be Howard, as Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. And as he said to me very clearly, at times of national crises, there are no ideological constraints. And if I walk into the wilderness one day and know that I've done my small bit to help a generation of Australians avoid long-term unemployment, what the economists call the scarring of the labour market, I will be proud of that. And it's not about me, it's about them. And the fact that we have seen 500,000 jobs being created since the last budget alone, the fact that the unemployment rate today is lower than when we came to government at 5.6%, and the fact that Australia is the first major advanced economy to see employment levels above where they were at pre-pandemic is something that we can all be proud of, but we also know the job is not done, and that's why last night's budget was the Morrison government's plan to lock in the recovery and ensure Australians are all better off.
Sarah Martin.
Thank you, Treasurer. Sarah Martin from The Guardian. This budget bakes in significant structural spending, including on the NDIS, aged care and the Stage 3 tax cuts. I appreciate you are still in the first stage of your fiscal repair strategy, but eventually you will have to turn your mind to budget repair, and certainly according to your forecast in the next term of government. So my question is, how do you foresee going about that budget repair task? Will it be through raising taxes or cutting spending? And will you be upfront with the Australian people in the lead up to the next election about your budget repair plans? And indeed, I give you the opportunity to promise no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no change to the GST, no change to pensions, and no cuts to the ABC or SBS.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Firstly, the budget has strengthened from the position it was just in last October. So net debt as a proportion of GDP, which is the key indicator of fiscal sustainability, is lower each and every year over the medium term compared to what was in budget just last October. And that the deficit's come down by 2/3 over the forward estimates. That's not an insignificant change from just 8 months ago, particularly off the back of a stronger labour market. And it's Treasury's expectation that over the next decade, you will see a growth in GDP, which is at a higher rate than the growth in the interest rate. And as long as that is happening, then you will see the debt as a proportion of the economy and our servicing costs be manageable. And that's what we've been focusing on. We have two specific stages and phases of our fiscal strategy. We are firmly in phase one, where the automatic stabilisers are working, where we are supporting specific areas of need, aviation, tourism, international education providers, the live entertainment industry, the construction sector. But what we have done, Sarah, is taken those emergency payments off where we can, like JobKeeper, like tapering down on the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement, like ending the cash flow boost, and we've moved to more to broader-based reforms like the skills, like some of the infrastructure projects and the like. When it comes to, and you reference, when it comes to those social services that we've invested in this budget, we were responding to a Royal Commission into aged care, which found shocking cases of neglect and abuse. And I think every Australian wants to see an aged care system which allows Australians to retire and to live their latter years with dignity and respect. And that's what we've sought to do. And the fact that we are making substantial funding decisions coupled with substantial reforms around residential care and home care and the role of the regulator and the role of the workforce goes exactly to that. And likewise with mental health. I've seen many people who have struggled with this condition, and it could be little things in this budget like helping somebody who attempted their life and went into a hospital, and now we're going to provide treatment for them after hospital so they don't have a repeat, or the treatment of eating disorders and increased research in those areas that can make the world of difference to so many people I'm very proud of those reforms. I think they were necessary reforms, and I think they'll make Australia a stronger place for it.
Colin Brinston.
Treasurer, Colin Brinston, AAP. A big spending budget, and you get a sugar hit in the next financial year with regards to growth. But then it tails off to below trend. And jobs and then wage growth only just creeps above inflation in 24-25. Are taxpayers getting real money for value here?
Well, the answer is yes. With respect to wages growth, as you know, it goes from 1.25 to 1.5, then to 2.25. So it gradually ticks up as we bring down that unemployment rate, and you get more competition for labour. But we're also, Colin, in a period with historically low interest rates where inflation has been very modest. So if you look at real wages are actually at the 10-year average. And we print a number with respect to inflation in the budget for mid this year where inflation kicks above 3%. But it's temporary. And it's temporary because in last year, 1920, we saw inflation go negative for the first time in 60 years because we had free childcare in the middle of the pandemic and some other factors that were at play. So yes, wages growth has been slower than we would like, but real wages is a key measure for you to look at. And because inflation has been modest, real wages has been at the 10-year average. We want to drive wages up. The way to do it is through driving the unemployment rate down. Treasury print a number saying we'll hit under 5% by the end of next year. That is a forecast which is even more conservative than the Reserve Bank. And with the mountain and wave of money that is now accumulated on household and business balance sheets, about $240 billion before last night's budget had been accumulated, that money will continue to be spent as long as we keep confidence in the economy. I can see those 250,000 jobs being created. And that was our plan last night, to create those 250,000 jobs.
Lani Scarr.
Treasurer Lani Scarr from the West Australian, thank you for your speech. You mentioned the measure just before in relation to helping people who have attempted suicide, so giving them aftercare support when they leave hospital. There's $158 million in the budget for that measure. 160 people in Australia attempt suicide every day. So is that money enough? And will you commit to extending that if it's necessary?
Well, all such measures like that continue to be evaluated to ensure that the money is getting directed to the people who need it most. It is not the first or the last word that we will have on suicide prevention and treatment. As I said in my speech, a National Suicide Prevention Office. Let's not forget that in this budget we were responding to a number of major reports, a Royal Commission into Aged Care, a Royal Commission into Natural Disasters, a Productivity Commission report into mental health. The measures in this budget on mental health are very, very substantial, including this head-to-health concept of extending out the Headspace model to people who are over the age of 25, with a national network of 40 of those centres. We're also giving people more access to Medicare for particular services, for example, with their families. If their families need to go and see a medical professional to work through mental health issues, we're now providing access through Medicare. It goes to, Lani, your question I think goes to the heart of what this budget's about, and it's about people. It's not about numbers, it's about people, whether it's people into their jobs, people getting aged care support, people getting disability support, people getting mental health support. We will take the steps necessary to ensure that those in need get the greatest attention and care.
Our last question is from Pablo Vinales.
Treasurer Pablo Viñales, SBS World News. You mentioned that you make no apologies for keeping the international borders closed, and that is purely based on the medical advice. Is it purely based on the medical advice, or do you acknowledge, does the government acknowledge that voters seem to like this more cautious approach? We've seen the trends at recent state elections, and is that something that is guiding your decision-making in this area?
The key factor, the central factor, the only factor for us is what keeps Australians safe. And it's not simply the rollout of the vaccine that is a factor for the Chief Medical Officer in making decisions around borders. They also need to take into account what is happening with the virus globally. Its transmissibility, new variants of the virus, and what it would mean for Australians' health and safety. So I can only comment on the circumstances which we are in today, where there are more than 800,000 new cases. We have to be very careful and cautious when it comes to opening up our country. We cannot avoid the dangers that may pose right now, and what we now must seek to do is protect Australians, their health, but also their economic recovery, and that is why we'll always follow the medical advice on these important matters.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note, and please join me in thanking the Treasurer.
Thank you.